It's been roughly 15 years since a psychologist explained to me that I had been raised by a narcissist. When she first brought the subject up, I thought she was wrong because I completely misunderstood what narcissism was. My therapist asked me to read an introductory book about clinical narcissism, and then I did a lot of additional reading in the weeks and months to come. I quickly learned that many victims of narcissistic parents become narcissists themselves. And as I thought about who I had become, I was forced to look very carefully at myself. And I was terrified to realize that I had learned some of my father's dysfunctional behaviors. The more I read and studied, the more I saw how my father's dysfunction had damaged me very deeply and had also influenced my behavior in relation to others in ways that I had never understood. But as I came to terms with the damage that he had done to me, I also had to confront myself about things that I'd learned from him. Was I a narcissist? Had I become similar to the person who had abused me for my entire life? It was terrifying for me to think about because I didn't want to be anything like him. I didn't want to hurt anyone. In the months to come, I slowly came to terms with what my father's narcissism had done to me. But I also identified thoughts and behaviors in myself that needed to change so that I wouldn't be like him, so that I wouldn't become an abuser. And I slowly developed a metaphor to explain what I had been through. Imagine a vampire story in which the vampire bites his victim, starting the process of turning him into another vampire. But then something happens and the vampire is killed. The victim is rescued. This person who the vampire had tried to make like him, and this victim goes back to the normal world. But the victim carries an unseen poison within, even though nobody can see that. And even though he never becomes an actual vampire. That's where I eventually found myself. You see, there are two stages of becoming a narcissist. I'm not saying this as a clinician, as a therapist. I'm just telling you according to my understanding of the process. The first is being taught to feel deep shame. And the second is learning to strike out against others as an abuser, as a defense mechanism against the shame. I escaped becoming an abuser, but I still struggle with the shame. The emotional poison that I grew up with is still inside me. I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but narcissists become what they are because of the intense shame that they feel inside. It's not conscious, but they don't feel good enough. They hate themselves on some deep level. Their real selves are so fragile and damaged that they construct a false self to project to the world. I used to assume that a narcissist's projection of a false self was mostly a matter of trying to get others to accept that false self, to hide what they really are from the world. But now I understand that narcissists are mostly trying to convince themselves. They are terrified on some level of what they believe they are. They are unconsciously afraid that they have no worth. They're afraid that they're not worthy of being loved. They're afraid if anybody really knows them, that person will reject them. I'm not trying to create sympathy for the narcissist by understanding this. I'm simply trying to understand the mechanism by which the abusive situation is created. All the victim see is the abuse, naturally. The victims and others who watch the narcissist just want to get away from this terrible person, as they should. They don't understand that there is a hurting person lurking beneath the abusive exterior. For the most part, it wouldn't help to understand it, though, because the narcissist is typically so disconnected from reality and from his own true self that he couldn't become vulnerable enough to understand his own pain and start to heal, even if someone could explain to him what was going on inside him. Social work researcher Brené Brown has done a lot of work about shame and what it really means in humans. One of the things she says is that, quote, shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love. When you understand that a narcissist is someone in incredible pain about his own lack of self-worth, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why he becomes a person who lashes out at others. It doesn't justify any of the abuse, of course, but it starts to make sense why it happens. Here's something that I've started to understand more clearly about myself. My father's abuse took me through the first stage of learning to be a narcissist. He taught me that I wasn't good enough. He taught me that I wasn't worthy of being loved for what I was, for what I am. He taught me that there was something fundamentally wrong and flawed about me. In other words, the narcissistic vampire bit me. I was infected with shame. But something happened to stop the dysfunctional process of turning me into a narcissist. Something in me would not move on to becoming an abuser, especially once I understood something about how the process worked. When I first started understanding narcissism and what my father had done to me, I couldn't yet see how close I came to becoming a narcissist. It would have been too painful in the beginning to realize what I've seen now. I had already numbed myself to the shame I had been taught to feel. By doing this, I was halfway down the narcissist road. The only thing that saved me was becoming conscious of what it was, and then intentionally becoming vulnerable with others. Over the last decade or so, I have spent a lot of time writing about my flaws and sharing it with the public. At first, it was just an instinct, but now I understand what I was doing. You see, being open about my flaws and failures prevents me from having to have a false self, which could lead me into narcissism. If I'm open with you about who and what I am, my fears, my failures, my shame, I can't have a false self to defend. The downside, of course, is that I feel shame about admitting to the things that most people hide. I feel shame about not projecting that I'm perfect. I used to want to project to everybody that I was perfect. I used to feel that way, and I was terrified when people could see how imperfect I was. I feel shame about showing myself to be someone who you might not love. But this stops me from deceiving myself, from deceiving either one of us, really. And that self-honesty short-circuits the mechanism which could make me act like a narcissist. The psychiatrist Carl Jung said, shame is a soul-eating emotion. I think I'm quoting that correctly. And I know that he's right about that. Shame can be so damaging that you feel you have nothing left and nothing to live for. It's a terrible place where I sometimes find myself. I don't know why I never turned into the abuser that my father was. I'd like to think that I'm just better than he was, or smarter, or a wiser person than he was. But I doubt that's true. Maybe I was just lucky. I don't know. Whatever the reason, I now see the pattern that started working its way through me when the narcissistic vampire bit me. He kept injecting me with his poison, but it somehow never completely took. I never became what he was. And the more I understood the process that was going on, the easier it was for me to avoid it entirely. I don't know if I will ever get away from the shame entirely. I might live the rest of my life constantly afraid that I'm not worth being loved and that anything that goes wrong for me emotionally is because I'm fundamentally flawed. I hope not. But that might be my reality. I know that I am intensely sensitive about some things which a lot of people would define to be harmless kidding from others. The people in my life have to understand that, and I have to constantly work to stop defensive reactions that would otherwise have me lashing out at the people around me. The one thing I know for certain is that I will never be an abuser. I know too much about this process, and I've worked too hard to be open about who my real self is. I have to keep working hard to be more and more honest with both myself and with those few who care to see, to avoid having the need to build a false self to protect. I suspect that the only thing that's ever going to change the shame and fear for me is having a long-term consistent love of being part of an emotionally healthy family, having a wife and psychologically healthy children. Right now, the truth is that I fear I'll never be loved by the sort of woman I need. That's my biggest terror, because it would prove my worst fear, that I'm not worthy of being loved. It's all complicated. I still have a lot to learn. I'm just grateful that I started down this long path of self-discovery 15 years ago. I'm very grateful that the narcissistic vampire who raised me didn't finally turn me into the clone who he always wanted me to be. I might share some of his shame. I might carry some of that shame to my grave. But I will never share his abusive ways. I will love instead. I choose to love. And I'm going to try desperately to be someone who is worthy of being loved in return.